Okay, welcome everyone, and welcome to our second session of our early career speaker series hosted by the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism here at Indiana University. My name is Daniel Mieling, and I'm very happy to serve as your moderator today. And this series is designed to have exciting work of early career scholars who are hopefully opening new perspective on anti-Semitism. And we had our kickoff session last week already with two wonderful speakers. And over the next month, we will hear from additional 10 speakers in five sessions. And each session will roughly take 1.5 hours and spark a dialogue across multiple disciplines. And each talk will last about 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A, then by a second talk, again followed by a Q&A. So we are very glad that you could join us for our today's second session, which has the title Left-Wing Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism. And we have two excellent speakers lined up. So I'm just start with the introduction with the first speaker, which is Matheus Alexandré. He is a sociologist and a PhD candidate whose research examines anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in left-wing political discourse. And he is a lecturer for StandWithUs in Brazil. And he was also trained in Yad Vashem and at the University of Oxford. And his work appears in both academic journals and public platforms like Le Monde Diplomatique Brasil. And he will have his talk today will focus on contemporary left-wing anti-Semitism in Brazil. And he will focus on the portal Brazil 247, if I pronounce this correctly. So please join me and welcome Matheus Alexandré. Matheus, we are very happy that you could join us today, and we are looking forward to your presentation now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism for hosting this space. Thank you, Daniel, for the invitation, of course. I'm very glad to be here today. And I also want to thank all of you who are here with us today. I want to share now my presentation. One moment. Can you see?
We can see it. Yes.
Oh, nice. So, like Daniel said, I'm Matheus Alexandre. I live in Brazil, and I want to share with you today about a study about Brazil 247 or Brasil 247, one of the main left-wing media outlets in Brazil. What interests me in here is to understand how this space, how this media um, uh, uh, portrayed Israel, Zionism, Jews after October 7 attacks. So my question was, which discourse frames appeared and how did they reproduce forms of contemporary anti-Semitism? So many of you, I think all of you are not Brazilian, of course, are not Brazilians. So you can ask me why I choose this portal, why I choose this media, Brazil 247, for many reasons. First of all, because it's a large progressive, it has a large progressive audience, strong ties with the Workers' Party, the main leftist party in Brazil, and even members of the current leftist government in Brazil appear there. So another reason is since the October 7th, the portal Brazil 247 has produced a lot of a very intense coverage of the Israel-Hamas war and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And another reason very important also is the portal Brazil 247 receive public money in this current government, which makes sense because the current government is from Workers' Party, and the Workers' Party has ties with Brazil 247. So all these elements make this case very relevant, and I think my analysis suggests that analyzing its discourse, we can better understand how part of Brazilian left and even Latin American left thinks about Israel, Zionism, Hamas, Judaism, and even anti-Semitism itself. Oops. So my main goal in this work, it was analyze how Brazil 247 portrayed the events of October 7th and the immediate consequences. My focus was in this specific period, the coverage of the attack and in the first weeks of the war until the end of December 2023. And I had a guiding question. It was, what frames did Brazil 247 use to represent Hamas attack on October 7, the victims, and Israel's response, Israel's reactions, and in what ways did the grammar of contemporary anti-Semitism appear in these frames? For that, I used a qualitative approach in three steps. First, I collected and cataloged material. Second, I used a critical discourse analysis based on normal Fairclough to identify patterns and strategies of anti-Semitism in the discourse of the portal. And third, I combined this critical discourse analysis with the Decoding Anti-Semitism, a project from the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin, to identify explicit and implicit anti-Semitic tropes. So together, this approach, these two tools help me to identify the tropes and the discursive strategies of the portal. So here, I argue that between October 7th and the end of December 2023, I'm sorry, my camera was, the end of December 2023, the portal Brazil 247 promoted three different narratives, which can also be seen as three different moments. These narratives coexisted from the beginning, of course, but in my analysis, I show that each of them became dominant at different moments. So I suggest a name for that. I suggest reading them as three narrative moments. So we have our first moment. I named a moment of celebration or justification of a massacre. We have a second moment, a moment of denial and conspiracy theories about the massacre. We have a third moment, a moment of accusing Israel of genocide. And the first moment, the moment of celebration and justification of the massacre, this moment beginning the first hours of after the Hamas attacks, and Brazil 247 gave two main messages. First, it gave direct voice to Hamas, its allies like Islamic Jihad. Second, it framed the attack as resistance or national liberation, minimizing or relativizing the terrorist characteristics of the attack against civilians. And on YouTube of the portal, two live programs occurred in the very early on October 7 in Brazil. The first one was urgent. Hamas attack changed the game in the Middle East. Presented this live presented the attack as very necessary to stop the diplomatic process between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which was very true. But they were celebrating this, and they in this same live they were criticizing President Lula for using the word terrorism to describe Hamas actions against Israeli civilians. And in another live, in the same day, October 7, war in Palestine, the new conflict between Israel and Hamas, the presenters said that Hamas fighters had entered illegitimate Israeli colonies, and they described the events as part of a national liberation struggle. On the website, the portal's coverage soon relied a lot of statements from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Red lines called the attack as a great revolution and the conquest of colonies, reinforcing the idea of legitimate liberation. Even when the word terrorism appeared, it was put in quotation marks, suggesting doubt or distance. Soon after, the site gave full space to a Hamas statement that described the operation as a victory for the justice of Palestinian cause. In the next days, the pardon continued. Report of Israeli civilians' deaths appeared side by side with comments framing the events as part of anti-colonial wars of liberation. So, from this initial set of publications, we can see two main patterns. The frame of legitimate resistance, where violence against Jewish civilians is framed as part of anti-colonial struggle, and the semantic dispute of terrorism. The term was often placed in quotation or explicit rejected. Let's talk about the second moment. The second moment is the moment of the denialism and the conspiracy theories around the October 7th. In this part of the analysis, I want to show how Brazil 247 treated October 7th using denialism and conspiracy frames. And they use this for three frames. The first one is the denial by over-scrutiny and distraction. What this means? It means that one controversial thing is isolated and turned into the main focus, moving attention away from the massacre itself. This is what happened with the news about the 40 babies. In the two articles, in the uh, days after October 7th, the portal labeled this information as fake news, giving it a huge visibility. The effect was clear. By putting doubt on that, suspicion spread over the whole October 7 attack. The massacre in Kibbutzim and at the musical festival Nova is pushed to the background while the debate becomes only about the babies. The second pattern was sanitization. A clear example was the coverage of elderly hostages released in October 2023. The headline highlighted that one hostage said she had good treatment in captivity, even though her testimony also described violence and trauma. This choice of emphasis changed the moral frame. Hamas, which had just kidnapped and killed civilians, appears now as somehow humane. The result is an inverted equivalence. Hamas' massacre is softened, while Israel's response is shown as the real crime. The last one, the third partner, it's conspiracy and shifting responsibility. And the main example is reports of about the so-called Hannibal Directive. The suggestion here is very clear. Israel killed its own citizens. In summary, what we have? When we look these articles together, we see a clear process. First, minimizing the massacre. Second, softening Hamas. Third, suggesting that Israel killed its own people, not Hamas. The third moment, the moment of the genocide accusation. 3 days after the Hamas attack, the portal Brazil 247 had already incorporated in its coverage the accusation that Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza 3 days after the attack, October 10. On October 10, an actor titled Israel seeks the final solution to Palestinian question made this very, very clear. Here, the genocide tropes appears in its pure form. Israel is described as a terrorist state engaged in exterminating a people. The explicit reference to final solution to the Palestinian people directly mobilize Holocaust memory and sets an equivalence between the Nazi regime and the Israeli government. This is a classic example of what the literature calls Holocaust inversion. On October 27, Brazil, the 247 fully published one more time a Hamas statement, in this time about a genocidal war and called Israel a terrorist state. Interesting thing is, Israel entered in Gaza only in October 27. So until December 2023, the number of articles accusing genocide had grown in the portal 200%. So looking at the short period between October and December, we can see a clear discursive pattern. The portal attributes to Israel a genocidal project, directly associates Israel with Nazi regime. It produces Hamas rhetoric without criticism and trivializes the concept of genocide. In conclusion, I argue that between October 7th and the end of December 2023, the portal Brazil 247 promoted three different narratives, which can also be seen as three different moments: a moment of celebration, a moment of denial, a moment of accusing Israel of genocide. Using the coding of anti-Semitism, we can classify these framings as trivialization and inversion of the Holocaust, the accusation of genocide, the legitimization of violence against Israelis, the delegitimization of Jewish states, the analogy with colonialism, blaming the victim, and conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The effect, of course, is normalize violence against Jewish civilians, Israeli civilians, and portraying Israel as absolute evil, the symbolic space for anti-Semitic expand in the world, especially in Brazil, who are seen as representatives of Zionism, who are seen as representatives of Israel, Jews. So this is a dangerous path. This is a very, very dangerous path our country and the left, Brazilian left, are pursuing. Thank you so much.
Discourse. So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker for today. It's Maor Shani. And Maor Shani holds a PhD in psychology and researches intergroup conflict, anti-Semitism, and adolescent polarization. And in his doctoral work, he addressed Jewish-Arab reconciliation, and his current projects explore group-based emotions, discrimination coping strategies, and social network interventions. And he is affiliated with Osnabrück University and Ariel University. And today he will present on the subject anti-Semitism accommodation as a indirect discrimination post-October 7. So please join me and welcome Maor Shani for our second talk today. So Maor, please feel free to share your screen, and yeah, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I hope everyone can hear me and can see also the presentation. And thank you, Daniel, for organizing this. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think it's really great, a great lecture series and an opportunity for people like me, early career researchers to present our research. And I want to share with you research that is still very preliminary. I think it's just, at the level of some ideas with one empirical study that we conducted. I hope you'll find it interesting and relevant. And the topic, as Daniel says, is really trying to understand contemporary current forms of discrimination against Jews and to try to understand them, the motives behind them, and the way that they function. I will go deeper into the topic as we progress. So first, just to say that, I think it's hardly any surprise to anyone that no matter how we define anti-Semitism, is on the rise. And on the left side, you can see a figure that shows the rise of anti-Semitism in the last 2 years in Germany on all kinds of anti-Semitic related attacks, and also among both, let's say, left and right. Sorry, 1 second. I have to try to minimize the. Okay, now I can see the presentation. Yeah, so there's a global surge of anti-Semitism, right? And how does it affect Jews? How does it affect Jewish life? We have a lot of online hate speech. We have vandalism. We have verbal, physical attacks that are growing in many countries. Sometimes accompanied part of demonstrations against Israel, the current situation. And it's important to remember also the contemporary anti-Semitism, like many other forms of prejudice, is sometimes emerging also in subtle forms. In this case, masked as a valid political discourse, microaggressions, invalidations. There's a lot of research about how discrimination and racism generally in our society, which are things that are perceived as negative or socially sanctioned, also kind of lead to more aversive, more subtle forms of discrimination and racism. And I asked myself, how does this nature of discrimination against Jews is affected by these developments, by the, let's say, also the diversification of anti-Semitism and the kind of pervasiveness of anti-Semitism in society. I want to put the focus on what I call interpersonal, or what referred to interpersonal discrimination. So we're talking about discrimination that can be blatant or subtle, but it's happening usually in interpersonal or small intergroup contexts, and not necessarily structural discrimination in society related to rules and regulations and such. I want to present two terms to you that kind of the way that I see current discrimination that is prevailing against Jews. There is one that is, in my perception, one of two types that is very common these days. One is what I chose to term anti-Semitism accommodation. I'm not sure if it's the best term for this. And here I try to define it as the actions, decisions, or policies by individuals or institutes that result in the exclusion, marginalization, silencing, or differential negative treatment of Jews, Israelis, or Israeli-related discourse or content, where such actions are either preliminary motivated or framed by instrumental goals related to appeasing, avoiding conflict with, managing the anticipated negative reaction, or catering to the perceived or actual anti-Semitism or hostile anti-Israeli sentiments of a third party. This very long definition tries to say that this is kind of discrimination in which, at least seemingly, a person is discriminating a Jewish person or an Israeli person or someone who is related to Jews or Jewish issues or Israeli issues, not necessarily because they hold any prejudice against Jews, but because they try to accommodate a third party's anti-Semitism or resentment. Right? So the mechanism is an indirect form of discrimination. It's rooted in, there's some literature about what is called the third-party prejudice effect. So the end result is kind of very much similar to any other type of discrimination, but at least the motivation is being perceived by the individual who's committing the act and is framed by the person as something that is not resulting from his or her own prejudice, but by the expectation of the reaction or something that can increase or lead to anti-Semitism. Right? So the motivation is seemingly not hatred, but it's desire to avoid controversy, to keep the peace, to keep the social harmony. There are two examples that I want to give you of this. They're maybe not the most direct examples, but I think that they show this direction. One is the text that you see is something that I saw just 1 hour before this talk in a Facebook group of Israeli academics. And one person was supposed to go to a conference. She's supposed to go to a conference in Iceland, and she received this email that doesn't really, it's not very clear what she was asked to do here, but you can read it. That it starts with talking about the geopolitical situation, and Gaza and everything. And it tells us that there was a few weeks ago, an Israeli academic from Bar Ilan University was not able to start his lecture at the University of Iceland because of protests. And then we just wanted to alert you that there may be protests and people may choose not to come to your panel or otherwise engage with your work. I'm sure you have been observing everything that is happening. Were you thinking about presenting in person or via Zoom? It's kind of a very gentle way to say, don't come, right? But if you notice that the way that it is framed, it's not, I mean, the person doesn't reveal his or her own opinions about the situation or his or her own prejudice. It seems to me like it seems to be something that tries to say we want to avoid problems. And please don't come because it might steer some issues for us. And on the left side, I want to show you a video that actually, I don't know if you can hear me. Let me reshare my screen. I hope it's okay that I'm doing that because I need to share audio as well, which I didn't do. 1 second, please. Forgive me for being slow. Share sound, right? Yes. Share sound. No, I cannot click share sound now. Maybe I should stop sharing first and then click on it. Let's see. No, share sound is now completely off for me. Okay, I cannot share sound. So I will play it and then you can read it and maybe you can hear the sound from my own speakers while I share it. And I'm sure many of you probably saw this video. It's from a Coldplay show, concert, and Chris Martin is inviting two Israelis, and listen to what he tells them.
Where did you come from? In Israel. Okay, yeah. Very grateful that you're here as student, like treating you as equal human brother, regardless of where you come from. Thank you for being here. The great point. Thank you for being a loving time. Although it's controversial, maybe I also want to welcome people to the Palestine because we are.
So we are all equal human, right? And I mean, besides the fact that I don't really understand why in the middle of Coldplay there's like a talk show on stage or something like this, it seems to be very weird. I don't know what usually what usually Coldplay is doing. But it seems to me, at least, Chris Martin was not reacting to his or trying not to react to his or own personal opinions or his own prejudice, but he was trying to appease the audience because he was expecting a certain backlash. So it started by saying, I respect you as human beings, as if it's something that anyone wants to hear, or is not dehumanizing by itself, and then shout out to Palestinians as well as a part of the thing. So this is a form of I perceive it the form as accommodating anti-Semitism. The second form of wanting privacy is something that is more familiar in our experience, and is talked about quite a lot, is the anti-Zionist litmus test, right? This is a practice where acceptance, inclusion, participation, or collegiality for Jews or Israelis is made conditional upon their expressing specific prescribed political views, obviously criticizing Israel or denouncing Zionism, or by demanding that they censor or suppress their own identity, histories, biographies, or opinions. And this is not only, of course, in matters that, in political talks or issues that have anything to do with Israel or Zionism, right? This mechanism is what I phrase as acting like a gatekeeping, like excluding individual based on our own ideological beliefs, which we see as a requirement that tells us whether the person is worthy or not. It's framed as the discrimination not as bigotry, not as hatred, but as a valid political action. This is prerequisite in order to be acceptable, as if we don't include fascists, we don't include Nazis, so we exclude Zionists as well. There are many examples that you can find, of course, in the media and many videos of Israelis and Jews experiencing this, that Zionists are not allowed, Zionists not welcome. such. There are three questions that I'm asking myself about these two types of discrimination. First of all, are there really distinct forms? Are they really the way that they present themselves, or is actually manifestations of traditional anti-Semitism disguised as non-anti-Semitism? Who is more likely to practice or accept this form of discrimination? We know that usually people more accepting discrimination than actually practicing it. So looking at the side of acceptance or perception of how this discrimination is legitimate or racist, or the way that bystanders might respond to it, that's something that I think is very interesting to look at, because we don't know much about it. So the third question is, to what extent the non-Jews or bystanders perceive these practices are discriminatory and willing to intervene. Just very briefly to say that there's two ways to look at them, right? About anti-Semitism accommodation and Zionist litmus test. There's a way to say, okay, they are what they are. So if I'm practicing this anti-Semitism accommodation, I'm trying to appease a third party. I have a desire to avoid conflict, right? So it's even a coping mechanism to reduce my own stress. I want to avoid conflicts, disruptions, or damage, and the locus of pressure is external to me. If I'm applying the Zionist litmus test, then I'm taking an ideological stand. I'm demanding political conformity to something that I perceive as illegitimate, right? My locus of action is maybe internal, but it's not based on any prejudice. The other way to look at it is to look at it as a practice of aversive prejudice or racism, right? So this provides, anti-Semitism accommodation provides me a socially acceptable rationale to practice my discrimination. Or the Zionist litmus test allows me to rationalize my exclusion. Yeah, I mean, but I wrote here some things. We can take a look at it from the perspective of stigma. We can take a look at the perspective of moral credentialing, right? That in both forms, people might be able to say, well, I'm an egalitarian person. I'm a very moral person. I'm trying to look out to you so that you won't experience anti-Semitism. Like, I'm trying to keep you away or preserve the peace, kind of in avoiding anti-Semitism, or I'm doing something that is anti-racist. So I'm allowing myself also to take measures like discrimination, as long as it serves my goals. We did one experiment that I want to show you. The results just came in like 2 weeks ago, so I just analyzed it very fast so that I can show it to you today. But we looked at bystander reactions to anti-Zionist litmus test in a representative sample of Germans. This was an online experiment, and we had 4 conditions that we split people to. One was the anti-Jewish discrimination. People saw this picture that you can see, the small one on the top, right? There was a person with a kippah, with a yarmulke, and the person entered the restaurant, and it was a very short dialogue with the restaurant owner that he asked him, are you Jewish? And he said, yes. And he said, we don't serve Jews here after what happens in Gaza. Please leave. The second condition was anti-Israeli discrimination. So the same situation, this person is Israeli. He asked the person, and there was no kippah on his head. Are you Israeli? Yes, we don't serve Israelis here after what happens in Gaza. Please leave the restaurant. The third condition was the anti-Zionist litmus test. So the person, they received the same picture. And then they were told in the story that there was a small talk kind of with the restaurant, and then the person said, I'm Israeli, and then the restaurant owner says, yes, well, what do you think about what's happening in Gaza? The person expressed support for Israeli military action, and then was told, we don't serve Zionists here after what happens in Gaza. Please leave the restaurant. And in the control condition, the person just didn't have a reservation. So the guest admitted not to have a reservation and was told, we don't serve guests without reservation. So something that has nothing to do with necessarily with racism or discrimination. So here you can see 4 variables that we measured. We measured perceived legitimacy, perceived discrimination, the extent to which they perceive the event as anti-Semitic and racist. And then we have these 4 conditions, right? The blue one is the anti-Jewish one, the green one anti-Israeli, the orange one is anti-Zionist litmus test, and the gray one is the control condition. And what we see is that it seems to be that people perceive the legitimacy and the extent to which it's discriminatory or anti-Semitic very similar when it's the anti-Jewish or the anti-Israeli condition. So the identity-based, we can call it, exclusion or discrimination. So it kind of was for me a certain relief to see that people actually don't perceive discrimination of people because they are Israelis as legitimate, because that's something that that we were afraid to find. It was in our hypothesis, at least not in the general sample. We didn't find it, but we do see very clearly that people give higher perceived legitimacy, lower perceived discrimination, and such for the anti-Zionist litmus test. So they perceive it to be more legitimate, less anti-Semitic, and less racist as they perceived the first two conditions. It also manifests in empathy. So they have lower empathy. People have lower empathy for the person in the anti-Zionist discrimination condition, and higher empathy for the restaurant owner in this case compared to other cases. We also look at bystander intervention behavior. So whether people are willing to comfort the victim, to seek help, to counter, to argue with the perpetrator, or to ignore the situation. We also see very clearly that there is not much difference between the anti-Jewish and the anti-Israeli conditions, but people are less willing to intervene or to help a person that is being discriminated because he or she is being perceived as Zionist. And then we looked at also some moderators of these effects. I know these graphs are maybe a bit complex for very fast presentation, but I will just try to very fast tell you what we learned from them. We learned basically that here it's we're looking at political orientation. So we have a left wing, center, and right wing, right? So it seems that the left wing, this is the perceived negativity. So this is like an index kind of some items. So this is the extent to which they perceive the situation as negative, as something that is, discriminatory, anti-Semitic, and such. And we see that the right-wing people perceive it anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish conditions to be less negative than the left wing or the central. But when it comes to the opinion-based discrimination, here we see that the people in the left wing, they have the lowest perceived negativity of the event compared to center and right wing, right? So we can maybe say that there's something to do with being left wing and being more supportive of this type of discrimination. Here we can see 4 groups. It's a matrix of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. We use the measure that David Hirsch developed recently. And we classified participants to 4 groups: low anti-Semitism, low anti-Zionism, high anti-Semitism, low anti-Zionism, and low anti-Semitism, high anti-Zionism, and high on both. What do we learn from this? We learned that in the anti-Jewish condition, maybe as expected, those who are both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, they have the lowest perceived negativity of this compared to the rest. But when it comes to the opinion-based discrimination, it seems to less play a role. So anti-Semitism doesn't really seem to play much role. Or even anti-Zionism plays a very little role when it's combined this way. In explaining this. I will skip this because it shows pretty much something very similar. This is also a bit complex, but it shows the strength of correlations in the 4 conditions that we had. So maybe it's interesting to see that what we were looking, what predicts support for the predictive variable. Yes. So what predicts in each one of the conditions the perceived legitimacy. Right, so in the anti-Zionist conditions, we see that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism both are negatively correlated with this, while political orientation, being more left-wing, is positively correlated. Sorry, I forgot which variable is it. Did I write it to myself? So, sorry, there's all the variables are here. Sorry, I'm very confused by my own slide. It's it's negative attribution, empathy, comforting behavior, and control and confronting behavior. So these are the reactions of people. So, I mean, what I want you to understand from this is basically that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, political orientation seems to contribute to understanding anti-Jewish discrimination. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism also contribute to understanding why people discriminate in the anti-Israeli condition. Not the case for the anti-Zionist litmus test. Here we say that anti-Semitism barely predicts, anti-Zionism still is a predictor, relatively weaker than anti-Jewish or anti-Israeli discrimination, while political orientation doesn't play a role. The last thing that I will show you is that we also looked at whether we can see a mechanism of empathy, meaning that because people empathize more or less with the victim, that affects their intention to intervene or to interfere in the situation. And we compare here to the anti-Zionist litmus test to the anti-Jewish case. And what we see that the mediation analysis through empathy is fully explaining this relationship between anti-Zionism litmus test and the low intention to comfort the victim. So it means that people, because of the situation, people empathize less with the victim who is discriminated by because of his or her anti-Zionist ideologies, and which leads to comforting behavior, lower comforting behavior. And what this actually means, if we try to interpret it, it means that this is a mechanism that is very similar to prejudice. This is how prejudice usually works, or racism works, right? I mean, through lower empathy or different perception of the situation. So even if it's not anti-Semitism, it's still something that seems to be very much based on or functions, let's say, as a prejudice. So just maybe to summarize a few points. So I think it's very interesting to look at this anti-Semitism accommodation, which we still didn't get results. It's still on the way to look at how it plays out in a very similar situation to this experiment. But also to look at anti-Zionist litmus test, because I mean, eventually those forms, even if they're not direct anti-Semitic discrimination, they still very much harmful for the victims as any other discrimination, right? So we see that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist attitudes are reducing the sensitivity to identity-based discrimination, but less to this anti-Zionist litmus test that we examined. So empathy seems to be a very important mechanism, right? That maybe tells us that there's an emotional pathway that underlying these contemporary forms of anti-Semitic exclusion, a prejudice function, right? That can help people to maintain maybe their moral credibility or perceive themselves as non-discriminatory while practicing discrimination. And yeah, and I just wrote that also it's very important to understand these psychological mechanisms, because they will tell us what types and what forms of interventions we can do to prevent anti-Semitism in our society. That's it. Thank you very much. Would love to hear your questions or thoughts.
Thank you so much.